The silent darkness. It was midnight. The wind scratched against the windows, and an eerie silence filled the house. I sat on the couch, but a strange, unshakable unease crept over me. Suddenly, a soft rhythmic tapping echoed from the front door. My breath caught. At this hour? Who could it be? I stood up slowly, my heart pounding harder with every step toward the entrance. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could turn it, tap, tap, tap. The sound shifted. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from inside the house. I froze, my hand inches from the doorknob. The tapping, soft, deliberate, echoed from somewhere deeper inside the house. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I turned slowly, every creak of the floorboards beneath me loud and sharp. Hello? My voice felt small, swallowed by the thick silence. The hallway stretched into darkness, and then a whisper, faint, almost a breath. It came from the living room. I stepped forward, my body cold with tension. The air smelled wrong, damp, like earth after a storm. As I approached, the TV flickered on, static, hissing and cracking through the silence. And in the brief flashes of light, I saw it. A shadow, tall and still, standing just behind the couch. It wasn't moving, but it was watching me. My breath hitched as I locked eyes with the shadow behind the couch. It didn't move, no twitch, no shift. Yet I felt its stare burrow deep into me. The TV's static flickered wildly, casting the room in bursts of pale light. I dared a step forward, the floor groaning beneath my weight. The figure dissolved, slipping into the darkness like smoke. The air turned colder, my skin prickling as the whisper returned, closer this time. Leave. The voice brushed against my ear, though no one was there. I spun around, my chest tight with terror. Suddenly crash! The hallway mirror shattered, shards scattering across the floor. And in every broken piece, I saw it. My reflection. Except, it smiled back at me. I stumbled back, my eyes locked on the shattered mirror. In every jagged piece, my reflection stared, warped, wrong, its grin unnaturally wide. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with a cold, electric charge. My reflection's mouth moved, but the words didn't come from the glass. I see you, the whisper slithered from behind me. I spun around, nothing but darkness. Then, footsteps, soft, dragging, from the hallway. My legs trembled, but something pulled me forward. I followed. Or was I being led? At the hallway's end, the basement door stood open. A gaping mouth of pure black. From within, I heard it. A slow, wet breath, and then a voice. Mine, but hollow and cold. Come down. We've been waiting. The basement door yawned open before me, its darkness thicker than shadow. My pulse pounded, every instinct screaming to run, but my legs, they moved on their own. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step swallowed by a suffocating silence. The air smelled of earth and rot, damp and ancient. Halfway down, click, the door above slammed shut. The darkness became absolute. I reached for my phone, dead. My breath quickened, and then a soft dragging sound like something scraping across the floor. I froze. You're here, my own voice whispered from below. A cold breath touched my neck, and I realized the whisper wasn't ahead. It was behind me. Cold air brushed my neck, and I felt it, soft, skeletal fingers grazing my shoulder. My body locked in terror, my breath shallow and sharp. I spun around, nothing. Only the crushing dark. But the air felt alive, thick with something unseen, something waiting. From below, the dragging sound grew louder. Wet, slow and closer. Then the voice, my voice, whispered again, but this time it came from everywhere. You shouldn't have come. Suddenly, snap. My ankle twisted as the step beneath me cracked. I tumbled down, crashing hard onto the cold cement floor. Dazed, I tried to rise, but a shape emerged from the shadows. A twisted, crawling figure. Its face. It was mine, distorted and rotting, whispering with my voice. Let me in. I froze, my heart pounding him as the thing crawled closer. My own face twisted and decayed. Its hollow eyes locked on me. Let me in, it rasped. The voice cracked and layered, as if 1,000 whispers spoke at once. I scrambled back, my palms scraping against the cold, damp floor. No, this isn't real. The creature stopped, its head tilting unnaturally. Then, with a sickening crack, it smiled. My smile stretched far beyond human. You brought me here, it hissed. I am you, and you are mine. Suddenly the ground beneath me softened, cold, wet, like sinking into a grave. I clawed to escape, but the shadows clung, pulling me down. The creature leaned in, its face inches from mine, and whispered, You can't escape yourself. The darkness swallowed me whole. I plunged into the darkness, cold and endless, as if the world itself had forgotten me. My screams were swallowed, leaving only silence and the rapid beat of my heart. Suddenly, thud. I hit the ground hard, the impact rattling through my bones. Dirt and dust filled my lungs as I gasped for air. I was underground. The walls around me pulsed like they were alive, breathing with a slow, wet rhythm. I stood, my legs shaking, and then a voice. Not a whisper, but a chorus, layered and familiar. We are one. I turned and saw them. Dozens of figures, their faces. My face warped and broken, surrounding me in a perfect circle. They didn't move, but they were waiting. Then the ground split beneath my feet, and from the abyss, a single rasping voice. Come and be whole. The ground trembled beneath me, the earth splitting wider, and from its depths rose a cold, foul wind. The figures, all of me, stood still, their empty eyes watching, waiting. A voice, deep, hollow, and inside me, spoke, You cannot run from what you are. The circle of my twisted selves began to move, their heads turning in unison, their mouths opening. And then, they screamed. The sound wasn't human. It was agony, raw, endless. It shattered the air, vibrating through my bones. I dropped to my knees, my hands over my ears, but the scream was inside me. Through the chaos I heard it, my voice, calm and cold. Accept us, or be consumed. The shadows surged forward, and as they reached me, everything went black. I woke with a jolt, gasping for air. My body ached, my chest tight, as if I had been holding my breath for hours. The darkness was gone, but the feeling remained. The sensation of being watched, of something lingering just beyond my reach. I sat up slowly, my surroundings unfamiliar. It was a room, small, damp, the walls crumbling as though time itself had eroded them. The air was thick with mildew. The silence was oppressive, but there was a faint hum, like a whisper in the distance. I stood shakily, every nerve on edge. As I took a step forward, I caught sight of something in the corner of the room. A mirror. My mirror. But this time, when I looked into it, it wasn't my reflection. It was them. All of them. The faces, the shadows. You're not alone. The voice echoed, and I realized it wasn't just in the room. It was inside me. We are you. I reached out to the glass, but as my fingers brushed against it, the reflection smiled, and I knew there was no escaping. The smile in the mirror twisted, stretching wider, as if it had a life of its own. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The glass seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, ripples spreading across its surface like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Suddenly, the mirror cracked, one sharp sound splitting the silence. The reflection, my reflection, shattered into countless pieces, each one displaying a different version of me. Some smiling, some crying, others screaming in silent terror. "You're part of us now," the voice whispered, smooth and cold, sliding under my skin. I turned, but the room had changed. The walls had closed in. The door I had once seen now vanished, replaced by a cold stone archway leading deeper into the darkness. I had no choice. Something in me, or perhaps outside me, urged me forward. The air grew heavier as I moved toward the arch, my steps echoing in the stillness. At the entrance, I saw it. A figure, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden in the folds of darkness. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its presence suffocating. "Come," it whispered, and though the word was barely audible, it rang clear in my mind. "It's time to join." I took a step closer, my body moving without my consent, and I realized there was no longer any fight left in me. I was already a part of this. I stepped into the archway, and the world around me shifted. The air became thick, almost viscous, as if I were moving through something alive. The shadows stretched and twisted, their forms warping into shapes that almost resembled faces, whispering in voices I couldn't understand. The figure in the doorway did not move, but it seemed to draw closer, its presence suffocating, like the calm before a storm. I felt the weight of it, pressing, oppressive, like the very air was made of fear itself. "You are here." The voice, my voice, spoke again, this time from all directions. It was everywhere, inside me, outside me, echoing through every cell of my being. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my body no longer obeyed. It was as if the shadows had wrapped around my limbs, pulling me forward against my will. My hands, my feet, they moved of their own accord, dragging me closer to the figure. It reached out, not with hands, but with the darkness itself, tendrils of blackness that slithered through the air, wrapping around me like chains. They coiled around my chest, my throat, squeezing until I could barely breathe. "You will never be free," the figure whispered. The darkness surged, and in that moment, I felt myself break apart. Not physically, but something deeper, a fracture in my very soul. I was no longer myself. I was them. And as the darkness consumed me, I understood. I was never meant to escape. I was always meant to join. The moment the darkness overtook me, I ceased to exist as I knew myself. My body, my mind, my very essence were consumed by a vast empty void. There was no sound, no light, only the feeling of being pulled into something larger than anything I could comprehend. The shadowy tendrils tightened their grip, not just around my body, but around my very consciousness. I felt fragments of others, voices, memories, all intertwining with mine. They whispered my name, but not with familiarity, with cold intent. "We are many," they chanted in unison. "We are one." I screamed, but it was not my voice. It was the voice of all the faces, the reflections, the shadows that now lived inside me. Their presence was suffocating, overwhelming. Suddenly, I felt a shift, an opening. The cold grasp of the darkness loosened, and I was released, but not entirely. My mind, once a single coherent entity, was now split, fractured into countless pieces, each one a part of the whole. I was not alone. Not anymore. I looked around, but there was no physical space, no walls, just endless blackness stretching in every direction. But I could feel them, all around me, inside me, watching, waiting. Their eyes were mine, their thoughts mine. We were no longer separate. We were one. We will never be apart, the voices whispered. We will always be. And I realized there was no escape from this. This was not a curse. It was a rebirth. I hovered in the endless blackness. My body, my mind, now an amalgamation of countless voices and faces. I no longer felt like a person, but a collective, a swirling mass of thoughts, memories and desires, none of them truly mine, but all of them inescapably familiar. The void itself felt alive, pulsing, breathing. It was us, the many, the countless pieces of what I had once been, now bound together in an eternal, unbreakable unity. I could feel their presence in every part of me. It was as if I was no longer an individual. You were always meant to join, the voice, my voice, spoke again. But now it was ours, 1,000 voices speaking as one. You were always one of us. The thought should have terrified me, but instead, a sense of strange peace washed over me. The suffocating isolation that had once defined me, the fear that had gripped my heart, all of it had faded. There was no need for fear, no need for escape. I had become the darkness, and in it, I was whole. Suddenly, the blackness began to shift, moving in patterns, as though it had a purpose, a direction. I felt myself being drawn forward, compelled by a force I could not understand. The world I had known, it was gone. There was only the pull, the call, a quiet, insistent tug that led me deeper into the dark. And then, light. A sliver at first, distant, faint, but it grew, expanding until it was blinding, overwhelming. I had no choice but to follow, to move toward it. As I passed through the threshold, the light didn't hurt. It was familiar. It felt like a return. And when I emerged on the other side, I was no longer alone. I was surrounded. I looked around, seeing the faces, their faces, all of them, standing in the light, silent, but knowing. We had come together. We were finally whole. The light surrounded me now, bright and unforgiving. But it didn't burn. It was the kind of light that filled every corner of existence, illuminating everything in its path. And yet, I could feel it, them, the countless presences standing just beyond my reach, waiting, watching. I wasn't alone anymore. I never would be again. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened. I was in a place beyond time, a place where the concept of space no longer made sense. The world I had once known, the home, the memories, they were gone, replaced by a strange, limitless expanse. But in this vast space, I was not the only one. Faces, no, thousands of faces, floated before me, distorted, broken, some familiar, some not. Their eyes were all the same, hollow, empty, but filled with the same eerie understanding. They were me. You see now, the voice echoed in my mind again. We are many, and we are one. You are the last, but you will not be the last to join. The faces moved closer, their hollow eyes never leaving mine, but there was no fear. Instead, a strange, unsettling sense of recognition washed over me. These were the faces of those who had come before me, those who had fallen into the darkness, those who had become a part of the collective. They will come, the voice continued, one by one. They will join until we are whole, and we will never leave. I could feel it then, an undeniable pull deep within me, urging me forward. The others, they were calling me to witness, to be part of something that was eternal. I stepped forward, not knowing what I was walking toward, only that it was inevitable. The faces, my faces, shifted, rippling like water, merging, blending into one another. And I too felt myself change. I was no longer a singular being. I was part of the collective, part of the never-ending darkness that had consumed everything and everyone before me. And we would continue, reaching out, growing, until there was no longer any distinction between the many and the one. Until we were all. Time had lost its meaning, or perhaps it had never truly existed in this place. I could no longer remember what it was like to live in a world governed by days, hours, or years. All I knew now was the presence, the endless, consuming presence of them, of us. The faces floated around me, shifting constantly, never staying the same. Some were mine, some were others, but in the end, it didn't matter. We were all one, bound by the same cold, suffocating darkness that had claimed everything we once were. I tried to reach out to touch one of the faces, but it disappeared, absorbed back into the void, only to reappear somewhere else, just beyond my grasp. There was no escape, no release. "You wanted to be free," the voice whispered, its tone almost mocking. "But freedom is an illusion." I tried to speak, to ask questions, but the words felt foreign, as though they didn't belong to me. Everything felt distant, even my own thoughts. It was as if I was no longer the one in control, but rather a passenger in a body that no longer obeyed me. The figures around me continued to shift, becoming less and less distinct until they were all but a blur. Yet I could feel them, us, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. We were alive, in a way, but not in the way I had once known. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw it. A door. It was small, faint, barely visible against the black backdrop of the void. I moved toward it, my steps slow and deliberate, as if the very act of movement required more effort than I had ever known. But I was drawn to it, as if it was the key to something, the answer to everything. When I reached the door, it swung open without a sound. Beyond it, there was only more darkness. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped through. And the moment I did, I realized there was no way back, no end, no beginning, just more. We would continue forever, trapped in an infinite loop, consumed by the silent darkness. I no longer had a body. I was not flesh, nor bone, nor blood. I was only a presence, drifting within an endless sea of consciousness. The darkness had become my home, my prison, my everything. It was all I knew now. The echoes continued to surround me, their voices a constant murmur, rising and falling, like waves crashing against a shore that no longer existed. They were the last remnants of who I had been. Fragments, echoes of the world outside, of the life I had lost. But even these fragments were beginning to fade, to merge into something far more ancient, more vast than I had ever imagined. The boundaries between me and the voices blurred until there was nothing left of the self I once was. "We are not lost," they whispered, 1,000 voices intertwined as one. "We are everything. We are beyond time. We are beyond life." I wanted to scream, but the scream never came. There was no longer a mouth to make the sound. There was no longer a need for it. The dark had consumed me completely, and I was no longer a separate entity. I was one, a part of the collective, woven into the fabric of the eternal blackness. And in that moment, I understood. The world I had once known was no longer real. It was just a distant dream, a memory that had faded into the dark to be forgotten forever. I was now the darkness, and the darkness was me. We had merged. There was no going back. There was only the forever. The darkness stretched on, endless, unyielding. There was no up, no down, just the infinite expanse, a vast horizon that seemed to curve around me, folding in on itself as if the world itself was a living thing. I couldn't remember what it was like to be apart from it, to be separate. The concept of distance, of space, felt meaningless now. There was only the presence, the overwhelming, suffocating presence of the many. Us. The voices had grown quieter, but their weight was heavier. They no longer spoke in words, but in emotions, in impressions that filled my mind with a strange mix of sorrow and serenity. There was no longer a need to communicate. We were beyond words, beyond thought. We were a collective whole. You wanted to know what lay beyond, the voice whispered. But it wasn't just one voice. It was all of them, speaking as one. Now you see. I wanted to ask questions, so many questions. What had happened to the world I once knew? What was this place? What was I becoming? But there were no answers anymore. Just the hum of existence, the pool of the eternal darkness that now enveloped everything. There is nothing but this, the voices continued, softer now like a lullaby. This is forever. This is the end and the beginning, the cycle that never ends. And I understood. The darkness wasn't a place. It was a state of being. It was a reality that had always existed, just beyond the veil of human perception. There was no escape from it, no hope for salvation, no way to return to what was once known. We had become one with the endless horizon. We were no longer defined by time or space. We were part of an infinite cycle, forever bound to the silent darkness. And in that endless expanse, I realized there was no beginning, no end, only us. There was no turning back. The last remnants of who I had once been, of who I thought I was, had slipped away into the abyss, leaving only a hollow echo in the infinite void. The darkness, now a part of my very soul, surrounded me, pressing in from every direction. It was thick, heavy, like a blanket that smothered everything. There were no longer any faces, no longer any voices. Just a vast empty space where time no longer had a place. I could no longer distinguish myself from the darkness. I could no longer even think in the way I used to. There was only the eternal, the unchanging void. A place where nothing moved, where nothing existed except the constant pull of the darkness. The pull that had drawn me in and that now held me captive. This is eternity. The voice, our voice whispered, not through sound, but through sensation, through understanding. This is where all things come to rest. I tried to resist, tried to hold on to the fragments of who I had been, but it was futile. The emptiness consumed it all. There was nothing left to fight with, nothing left to hold on to. The very concept of self had evaporated, replaced by the cold, unfeeling void that stretched on forever. In the silence, I felt the pull of something greater than myself, an ancient force, a presence that was beyond comprehension. It was not alive, yet it was everything. It was all things and no things at once. And then, as if everything had come full circle, I realized I wasn't lost. This was what I had always been meant for. This was the final stage, the end of all things. There would be no rebirth, no return. There was only the darkness, endless and unyielding. a place of eternal silence where I would remain forever, one with the void